The story of the Ashford family does not begin with a birth, but with a bargain made in the suffocating darkness of a forgotten era. Imagine a world where the sun seems to lose its warmth the moment you step across a certain threshold, where the very air feels heavy with the weight of unconfessed sins and ancient, rotting secrets. The Ashford Estate, a sprawling monument of decaying Victorian architecture, sits like a jagged crown upon a hill that the locals have long since abandoned to the weeds and the crows. To understand the Ashfords is to understand a descent into a specific kind of madness, a madness fueled by the desperate desire to outrun mortality at any cost, even if that cost meant shredding the very fabric of their humanity. This isn't just a chronicle of a wealthy family gone wrong. It is a meticulous autopsy of a spiritual cancer that spread through generations, leaving behind a trail of empty graves and echoing screams that still vibrate in the floorboards of the manor today. As we peel back the layers of this macabre history, prepare yourself to confront a reality where the boundary between the living and the dead is not a wall, but a thin, translucent veil that the Ashfords tore apart with their own blood-stained hands. Silas Ashford, the patriarch who first laid the foundation of this nightmare in the mid-1800s, was a man of cold intellect and even colder blood. He was a pioneer of industry, but his true passion lay in the procurement of things that should never have been found, relics from sunken civilizations and scrolls written in languages that predated the arrival of man on this continent. Silas didn't just build a house, he engineered a trap for the ethereal, incorporating sacred geometry and forbidden symbols into the very masonry of the walls to ensure that nothing, not even a soul, could escape the perimeter once it entered. It was said that he spent his final years in the basement, lit only by candles made from the rendered fat of black goats, whispering to the stone as if it were a living, breathing entity. His obsession with his late wife, Abigail, drove him to explore the gray spaces, the theoretical dimensions where consciousness lingers after the heart stops, and it was here that he found a way to tether her spirit to the house. The townspeople whispered that Silas hadn't lost his mind, he had simply found something else to fill the void where his soul used to be, and that something was hungry, ancient, and utterly without mercy. The second generation of Ashfords, raised within the claustrophobic confines of Silas's architectural madness, never stood a chance at a normal existence. Eleanor Ashford, the eldest daughter, was a pale, translucent girl who was never seen without a heavy iron key hanging around her neck, a key that allegedly opened a room that didn't appear on any of the house's blueprints. She spent her childhood playing games with unseen friends who left small, bird-like footprints in the dust of the attic, and by the time she reached womanhood, she had mastered the art of automatic writing, producing thousands of pages of text in a script that burned the eyes of anyone who tried to read it. The nursery was not a place of laughter, but a sterile chamber where the Ashford children were taught that the world of the living was merely a crude illusion, a temporary skin to be shed in favor of a much darker, eternal glory. It was Eleanor who first introduced the concept of the silent meal, where the family would sit for hours in total darkness, listening to the house breathe, believing that the walls were communicating the secrets of the afterlife to those who were quiet enough to hear. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Ashford fortune was diverted into the most grotesque scientific pursuits imaginable, blending the burgeoning field of electricity with the ancient art of necromancy. Julian Ashford, Silas's grandson, was a brilliant surgeon whose career ended abruptly when he was caught attempting to transplant the eyes of a freshly departed vagrant into a porcelain doll. He retreated to the estate's east wing, transforming it into a high-voltage laboratory where he sought to capture the spark of departure, the exact moment the soul leaves the body, using massive copper coils and primitive vacuum tubes. Julian believed that if he could freeze that spark, he could create a bridge between worlds, allowing the Ashfords to command the dead as a literal army of servants and advisors. The local morgues began to report a series of daring thefts, with bodies vanishing before they could be interred, and the smoke rising from the Ashford chimneys took on a greasy, iridescent hue that made the birds fall dead from the sky. Julian's journals are a descent into a clinical hell, filled with sketches of hybrid creatures that defied every law of biology, proving that the family had moved beyond mere eccentricity into a realm of pure, unadulterated blasphemy. One of the most terrifying features of the Ashford Manor was the legendary mirror room, a circular chamber where every inch of the wall, floor, and ceiling was covered in handcrafted silvered glass. Thomas Ashford, Julian's brother, became obsessed with the idea that mirrors were not just reflective surfaces, but windows into a reverse reality, where the Ashford sins were reflected as virtues, and their deaths as new beginnings. He spent decades refining the silvering process, allegedly adding crushed, human bone to the mixture to give the mirrors a psychic resonance that would allow them to hold images of the past and future. Visitors, those few who were ever invited and actually returned, spoke of seeing their own reflections move independently of their bodies, or seeing the faces of dead relatives staring back at them with hollow, pleading eyes. Thomas eventually disappeared within that very room. The only thing found was his clothing, neatly folded in the center of the floor, and a single mirror that remained warm to the touch for 3 days after his vanishing. It is whispered that Thomas didn't die. He simply stepped through to the other side, and he is still there, watching us from the silver depths of every mirror that still hangs in that cursed, decaying house. By the mid-1930s, the Ashfords had ceased to be a family in the traditional sense and had become the center of a clandestine cult that attracted the most depraved elements of high society. They called themselves the Keepers of the Crimson Root, believing that the Ashford bloodline was the only thing standing between the world and a primordial chaos that they both feared and worshipped. These secret gatherings involved rituals that took place in the lower garden, a subterranean conservatory where Julian had successfully cultivated a species of carnivorous flora that thrived on blood rather than sunlight. The members of the cult would provide offerings in exchange for glimpses into the void, or for the promise of a life beyond the grave that didn't involve the traditional concepts of heaven or hell. The Ashford Manor became a beacon for the lost and the wicked, a place where the rules of morality were suspended in favor of a dark, hedonistic pursuit of the ultimate truth. However, the Crimson Root required more than just animal sacrifices. It demanded a piece of the soul of everyone who participated, leading to a slow, agonizing decay of the cult members' physical bodies and mental faculties. The most infamous chapter in the Ashford history is the night of the 1944 Winter Gala, an event that was supposed to celebrate the family's total mastery over the gray spaces. Over 50 of the social elite arrived in their finest silks and tuxedos, their carriages and early automobiles lining the long, winding drive like a funeral procession. The house was ablaze with light, and music could be heard echoing across the valley, a strange, dissonant melody that seemed to change key with every heartbeat of the listeners. But, as the clock struck midnight, the lights didn't just go out. They were swallowed by a darkness so absolute that it seemed to have physical weight, a darkness that snuffed out every candle and every lantern instantly. When the sun rose the next morning, the house was perfectly silent. The doors were locked from the inside, and not a single soul, host, guest, or servant was ever seen again. The food was still on the plates. The champagne was still bubbling in the glasses, but the people had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only a faint scent of ozone and the lingering echo of a scream that no one could quite locate. After the great disappearance, the town attempted to reclaim the land, but they quickly realized that the Ashford curse had seeped into the very earth itself, poisoning the ground for miles in every direction. Farmers found that their livestock would refuse to graze near the estate's borders, and those animals that did would give birth to two-headed calves or eyeless colts that died within hours. The trees in the area began to grow in distorted, agonizing shapes, their branches twisting back toward the house, as if seeking some dark nourishment from the ruins. Even the water in the local wells turned brackish and metallic, tasting of iron and old copper, leading to a wave of mysterious illnesses among the remaining townspeople. It was as if the estate had become a black hole of vitality, drawing all the life force out of the surrounding environment to fuel whatever dark process was still occurring within its boarded-up walls. The land was eventually designated as a wasteland, a dead zone that even the most daring developers wouldn't touch for fear of what they might unearth beneath the scorched, blackened grass. Local folklore is filled with stories of the shadow people who haunt the perimeter of the Ashford Estate, figures that are darker than the night itself and move with a fluid, unnatural grace. These aren't your typical ghosts. They don't rattle chains or moan in the dark. They simply watch, their presence felt as a sudden drop in temperature and a feeling of intense, predatory malice. Some believe these shadows are the remains of the guests from the 1944 Gala, their souls stripped of their identity and bound to the house as eternal sentinels. Witnesses have reported seeing these figures standing in the upper windows, their silhouettes elongated and distorted, gesturing for passers-by to come closer to the rusted iron gates. If you look too long into their eyes, which are nothing more than voids within the darkness, you begin to lose your sense of direction, feeling an irresistible urge to walk toward the house. Even as your every instinct screams at you to run, the shadows are the house's immune system, a defensive layer of pure dread designed to keep the curious away while the Ashford legacy continues its slow, silent evolution in the dark. In the 1970s, a brave investigative journalist named Margaret Miller managed to spend 3 nights inside the Ashford ruins, and her subsequent journals provide the only modern glimpse into the interior of the nightmare. Margaret wrote of walls that felt like skin warm to the touch and slightly damp hand of a constant, low-frequency humming that vibrated in her teeth and caused her nose to bleed. She discovered a room filled with thousands of jars, each containing a single, perfectly preserved human ear, all labeled with names of people who had been reported missing over the last century. On her final night, she recorded hearing the voice of Silas Ashford himself, whispering to her from the vents, offering her the gift of the third eye if she would only open the cellar door. Margaret escaped the house at dawn, but she was never the same. She spent the rest of her life in a sanitarium, drawing pictures of a great red eye that she claimed lived in the foundation of the manor. Her journals were eventually suppressed by the authorities, but leaked fragments describe a reality so horrific that it makes the wildest ghost stories seem like bedtime tales for children. Modern paranormal researchers who have studied the Ashford site with advanced equipment have discovered that the laws of physics appear to be fundamentally broken within a 50-yard radius of the house. Electromagnetic fields EMF fluctuate in patterns that suggest a conscious intelligence, often spelling out messages in Morse code or forming complex, geometric shapes on digital displays. Time itself seems to dilate. Investigators have entered the house for what they thought was 10 minutes, only to emerge and find that 6 hours have passed in the outside world. This suggests that the Ashfords didn't just haunt the house, they turned it into a localized singularity, a place where the standard rules of the universe are overwritten by the family's collective willpower and occult rituals. Some theorists suggest that the house is no longer in our dimension at all, but is merely a projection of a structure that exists in a much darker, much older reality. This would explain why the house refuses to decay despite decades of neglect. It is being maintained by forces that do not answer to the second law of thermodynamics, making it a permanent scar on the face of the earth. The Ashford name has mostly vanished from the public record, but the blood echo continues to manifest in distant descendants who have no idea of their dark heritage. These individuals often suffer from a specific set of symptoms: an irrational fear of mirrors, a talent for languages they have never studied, and a recurring dream of a house on a hill that they feel an overwhelming homesickness for. It is as if the Ashford DNA carries a set of instructions, a biological imperative, to return to the source and complete the work that Silas started so long ago. There are documented cases of people from across the globe suddenly abandoning their lives and traveling to the ruins of the estate, drawn by a psychic pull that they cannot describe. Once they arrive, they are often found in a trance-like state, carving the Ashford family crest into their own flesh or attempting to dig into the basement with their bare hands. The family is not dead. They are simply waiting for enough of their blood to return to the soil to trigger the final awakening, a moment that the journals suggest will change the world forever. If you were to stand in the center of the Ashford Grand Foyer today, you wouldn't hear silence. You would hear the whispering walls, a phenomenon where the structural materials of the house play back the sounds of the past. It is a cacophony of overlapping voices, Eleanor's chanting, Julian's surgical saws, the terrified pleas of the 1944 guests, all blended into a single, rhythmic pulse. The wood and stone have become a living recording medium, saturated with the intense emotional energy of the horrors that occurred within them, creating a permanent feedback loop of trauma. Some psychics claim that the walls are actually trying to warn people to stay away, while others believe the house is trying to teach its history to anyone who will listen, seeking a witness to its dark glory. The whispers are said to be addictive. Once you hear them, every other sound in the world feels thin and meaningless, leading many who hear them to return to the house again and again until they eventually disappear into the shadows. The walls don't just have ears, they have memories, and they are more than happy to share them with anyone who is foolish enough to get close. Beneath the floorboards of the Ashford Manor lies a secondary structure that is reportedly 3 times larger than the house itself, a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers carved directly into the bedrock. This lower manor was where the true Ashford history was written, far away from the prying eyes of the law or the judgment of God. It consists of massive libraries filled with books bound in human skin, and meditation cells, where family members would spend months in total isolation to purify their minds of human empathy. There are also reports of a central chamber known as the Well of Souls, a bottomless pit that ALLEGEDLY connects directly to the gray spaces Silas was so obsessed with. The air in these tunnels is said to be freezing cold, even in the middle of summer, and it smells of ancient dust and something sweet, like rotting lilac. No one who has entered the lower labyrinth has ever returned with their sanity intact, as the geometry of the tunnels is designed to disorient the human brain, leading the victim deeper and deeper into the dark until they forget who they are and why they came. In the heart of the ruins, there is said to be a single portrait that remains untouched by dust, moisture, or time, the image of Silas Ashford, painted shortly before his disappearance. The eyes of the portrait are not paint. They are rumored to be the actual eyes of Silas himself, preserved through some alchemical process and set into the canvas. Those who have seen the portrait claim that the eyes follow you with a terrifying intensity, and that the expression on Silas's face changes depending on the time of day, smiling mockingly at noon, and twisted into a mask of pure rage at midnight. The portrait is the anchor for Silas's spirit, a direct link between the physical world and whatever hell he currently inhabits, allowing him to exert his will over the house even from across the veil. Many believe that if the portrait were ever destroyed, the entire estate would collapse, but every attempt to remove it or burn it has ended in disaster, with the perpetrator suffering from sudden, violent strokes or being consumed by invisible flames. Silas is still the master of the house, and he does not take kindly to those who would deface his image or challenge his authority. The Ashfords believed that their ultimate power could only be achieved during a red moon, a rare lunar eclipse that they interpreted as the opening of the eye of the abyss. Their history is punctuated by these events, with each red moon marking a significant escalation in their occult activities and a corresponding spike in local disappearances. During these nights, the house would pulse with a dull crimson light, and the shadow people would become physical enough to leave bruises on the skin of anyone they touched. The ritual involved the weaving of fates, where the family would attempt to tie the destiny of the town to the destiny of the Ashford bloodline, ensuring that as long as the town existed, the Ashfords would never truly die. The last Red Moon ritual in 1944 was clearly a success in their eyes, as it resulted in the total ascension of the family into a higher state of malevolence. Even now, whenever a lunar eclipse occurs, the area around the Ashford Estate becomes a lightning rod for paranormal activity, with strange lights and sounds emanating from the ruins that can be seen and heard for dozens of miles. The church records in the nearby town show a disturbing pattern of priests who attempted to exorcise the Ashford Estate, only to lose their faith, their sanity, or their lives within days of the attempt. One particularly famous account, from Father Thomas O'Malley in 1912, describes the house as a theological black hole, a place where the presence of God is not just absent, but actively repelled. He wrote that his holy water turned to blood as he crossed the threshold, and his prayers were answered not by silence, but by a chorus of mocking laughter that seemed to come from his own shadow. The Ashfords had successfully created a space where the traditional laws of spiritual protection did not apply, a sanctuary for the damned where evil was not a visitor, but the resident authority. This has led to the area being declared anathema by several religious organizations, with warnings issued to the faithful to avoid the site at all costs. The Ashford history is a testament to the idea that some places can become so saturated with sin that they are beyond redemption, serving as a permanent beachhead for the forces of darkness in our world. Despite the warnings and the boarded-up windows, the Ashford Estate continues to claim victims in the modern era, with a steady stream of hikers, teenagers, and ghost hunters vanishing without a trace every year. The police files for the area are filled with cold cases that all share a common thread. The last known location of the victim was within sight of the Ashford chimneys. Unlike the 1944 Gala, these disappearances are quiet and efficient, with no evidence of struggle or foul play. Just a car left on the side of the road and a set of footprints that lead toward the house and then simply stop. Some believe the house is feeding on these individuals to maintain its structural integrity, while others think the victims are being recruited into the shadow army that serves the family in the gray spaces. Whatever the truth, the Ashford Estate remains the most dangerous unsolved mystery in the country, a place where the missing are not just lost, but integrated into a macabre history that is still being written one soul at a time. In a dusty archive in the state capital, there exists a document known as the Final Will and Testament of the Ashford Estate, which was filed by a mysterious lawyer shortly after the 1944 disappearance. The document doesn't list assets or heirs. Instead, it is a series of prophetic statements about the return of the king and the dissolution of the sun. It claims that the Ashford family has not left, but has merely reconfigured themselves into a new form that will eventually reclaim the entire world as their estate. The will concludes with a terrifying promise: "We are the cracks in your walls, the cold in your bones, and the darkness in your dreams. We are the Ashfords, and we are coming home." This document suggests that the entire history of the family was just a preparation for a much larger, global event, a sinister tale that is only now entering its final, most horrific act. To read the will, to understand that the Ashfords were never just a family. They were a blueprint for a new kind of existence, one that thrives on the very fear and suffering they spent centuries perfecting.